Let me tell you something obscene about this Iran water crisis. Everyone is talking about drought, climate change, natural disaster. Yes, of course. But this is not the real story. The real story is this: Iran is experiencing its 6th consecutive year of drought. 19 dams are at less than 5% capacity. The capital, 15 million people might run out of drinking water within weeks. The president is talking about evacuation. And here is the obscene part. A recent survey found that 75% of Iranians blame the crisis not on climate, not on sanctions, but on domestic mismanagement and inefficiency. 75%. Do you understand what this means? The people living through the catastrophe know it is not a natural disaster. They know it is a systemic failure. And yet, and this is where ideology does its most brutal work, the system continues. Business as usual, market logic, privatization of resources, the so-called water mafia companies linked to the Revolutionary Guard, profiting from dam construction while aquifers collapse. This is not drought. This is ideology in its purest, most lethal form. This is what happens when you treat water, the fundamental condition of life itself, as a commodity. And now, when the system finally reaches its breaking point, when the market cannot solve the crisis because the market created the crisis, we arrive at this uncomfortable truth. Only something like emergency communism can respond. I know, you hear communism and you think Žižek has finally lost it, but listen carefully. I am not talking about Soviet nostalgia. I am talking about what happens when the basic logic of capitalism, scarcity, competition, profit, encounters the absolute limit of physical reality. Water is running out, not as metaphor, actually running out. What do? Let me explain what I mean by ideology here. We are used to thinking that free markets create efficiency. Competition drives innovation. Private ownership encourages responsible management. This is the mantra. Yes, the invisible hand. But what happens when the invisible hand is holding an empty bucket? Iran's crisis exposes something fundamental about market ideology. It only works when resources are renewable, when scarcity is artificial, when the game can continue indefinitely. But water is not renewable at the rate we consume it. Aquifers take thousands of years to recharge. Rivers do not care about quarterly earnings. The hydrological cycle does not respond to price signals. And yet, look at what Iran did. For decades, the government, supported by military-linked construction firms, built hundreds of dams. They drilled approximately 1 million wells, half of them illegal. They expanded agriculture to achieve food self-sufficiency, using 90% of the country's water to produce only 12% of GDP. Why? Because in market logic, this makes sense. Dams are infrastructure, wells are investment, agriculture is growth. Each decision individually follows perfect economic rationality, but the sum total, catastrophe. This is what I call the paradox of rational irrationality. Every actor behaving rationally within the system produces collective suicide. The farmer drills a well because his neighbor drills a well. The company builds a dam because there is profit in construction. The government expands agriculture because food independence sounds strategic. Each decision is defensible. The outcome is apocalyptic. And here is where it gets really obscene. Even now, as Tehran runs dry, the proposed solution is another mega project. A 1,000-kilometer pipeline from the Sea of Oman. Desalination, more infrastructure, more investment. But experts are already warning, this will not solve the problem. It will displace it. The brine discharge will poison the Gulf of Oman. The energy cost will be astronomical. And most importantly, it does nothing to address the actual issue. 90% of water going to agriculture that produces 12% of GDP. So why do it? Because the system cannot think outside its own logic. The market solution to market failure is always more market. This is ideology at its purest, not false belief, but the structure that determines what counts as a solution in the first place. And when you are trapped in this structure, when every possible move within the system reproduces the problem, you arrive at a terrifying conclusion: the system itself must change. Not reform, not optimization, change. This is what I mean by emergency communism. Not an ideological preference. A physical necessity. When water runs out, you cannot price it efficiently. You cannot let the market allocate it. You must ration it. You must enforce collective discipline. You must subordinate individual profit to collective survival. This is not politics, this is physics. Let me give you a small example. Tiny detail, but it reveals everything. A few weeks ago, there was a video going viral in Iran. A swimmer at Karaj reservoir. You know what he was doing? He was walking, not swimming, walking, because the water level was so low that large parts of the reservoir were just mud. You could walk across what should have been deep water. And people in the comments, Iranian people, mind you, people living through this crisis, they were making jokes. Dark jokes. Finally, we can walk on water like prophets. The Islamic Republic has achieved a miracle. But here is what struck me about this. The jokes were not just coping mechanisms. They were ideological critiques disguised as humor. Because what the jokes reveal is that everyone knows the system is failing, everyone knows the solutions being proposed are absurd, and yet everyone also knows that nothing will fundamentally change. This is the structure of cynical reason, not naivete, not false consciousness, but the knowledge that you are being lied to, combined with the feeling that this knowledge changes nothing. You know, the water crisis is caused by mismanagement. You know, the mega projects will not work. You know, the water mafia is profiting while aquifers collapse. You know all of this. And yet, you still participate. You still buy water storage tanks when the government tells you to. You still pray for rain, even though you know the problem is not rain, but irrigation policy. You still treat it as natural disaster, even though you know it is systemic failure. This is what I call the obscene supplement of ideology. The part of ideology that is not hidden, but openly acknowledged, and yet still functions perfectly. In the old days, ideology worked by hiding the truth. The king is chosen by God. The market is natural. Technology will save us. But modern ideology does not hide. It confesses. It tells you exactly how it works. Yes, this is propaganda. Yes, the system is corrupt. Yes, we are destroying the planet. And then it continues anyway. Why? Because the alternative seems impossible. Not morally impossible, practically impossible. This is the genius of late capitalism. It has made its own alternative unthinkable, not by repression, by absorption. You want to criticize the system. Great. Here is a documentary about it on Netflix. You want to propose solutions? Wonderful. Here is a TED Talk platform. You want a revolution? Sure. There is an app for that. Everything is permitted except the one thing that would actually change anything. Stopping. This is why I say emergency communism is not a choice. It is what happens when stopping becomes the only option. When the aquifer is empty, you cannot choose to keep drilling. When the reservoir is dry, you cannot choose to keep irrigating. When water runs out, the system stops. Not because of ideology, because of physics. And the question then becomes, do you plan for this stopping or do you let it happen chaotically? Now let us talk about what they call the water mafia. This is not conspiracy theory. This is documented fact. Construction companies linked to Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps have built hundreds of dams and water transfer projects. They profit from each new infrastructure project. They have zero incentive to actually solve the water crisis because solving it would mean stopping construction. So what do? They build more dams, they propose more transfers, they create more projects, and with each project the crisis deepens. Because you cannot solve over-extraction by building more infrastructure to enable more extraction. This is like treating alcoholism by building better bars. But here is the truly obscene part. This is not unique to Iran. This is the logic of capitalism everywhere. Look at climate change. We have known about it for 50 years. We have all the technology needed to address it. Solar, wind, nuclear efficiency improvements. We could decarbonize tomorrow if we wanted. But we do not want. Or rather, the system does not want. Because decarbonization would require stopping profitable activities, closing oil wells that still produce revenue, shutting down factories that still generate returns, leaving resources in the ground when you could extract them. And capitalism cannot do this, not because of evil intentions, because of structural logic. If ExxonMobil stops drilling, British Petroleum will keep drilling. If the US reduces emissions, China must still industrialize. If I stop consuming, the economy contracts, people lose jobs, governments fall. So we continue. We build carbon capture technology, more infrastructure, while still burning fossil fuels. We create carbon markets, more commodification, while still increasing emissions. We propose green growth, more capitalism, while the planet burns. This is the water crisis writ large, rational actors, systemic catastrophe. And Iran is just the first place where this logic hits physical limits that cannot be negotiated away. You cannot negotiate with an empty aquifer. You cannot market incentivize rain. You cannot privatize the water cycle. When the reservoir is at 5% capacity and 15 million people need to drink, what do? This is the moment when ideology must confront reality. And ideology always loses that confrontation. The question is only how much suffering happens before the confrontation ends. Let me be very precise here. Iran's government will not voluntarily adopt communism. Do not misunderstand me. What will happen is that physical necessity will force coordination, rationing, collective planning, all the things that free market ideology insists are inefficient and authoritarian. But when water runs out, rationing is not authoritarian, it is survival. When aquifers collapse, collective planning is not inefficient, it is the only option. When the crisis is absolute, emergency measures become permanent structure. This is what I mean by emergency communism, not an ideological victory, a systemic inevitability. And the tragedy, the absolute tragedy, is that we could have planned for this, we could have implemented rational water management decades ago. We could have limited extraction, enforced efficiency, protected aquifers. But we did not, because in capitalism, long-term collective survival is always sacrificed for short-term individual profit. And now we are here, watching a civilization collapse in real time. Not from war, not from invasion, from water management. So we return to the question, what happens when 15 million people have no water? The president suggests evacuation, but evacuate to where? Every city in Iran faces the same crisis. Every aquifer is depleted. Every river is drying. Every dam is empty. You cannot evacuate from a systemic crisis. You can only face it. And facing it means doing exactly what capitalism insists is impossible. Collective sacrifice, enforced rationing, subordination of profit to survival. This will not look like your grandfather's communism. There will be no revolution. No overthrow, no workers' councils. It will look like emergency measures that never end, water rationing that becomes permanent, state control of resources that cannot be privatized, collective planning because the alternative is death, and the ideological structure will adapt. It always does. They will not call it communism. They will call it crisis management, emergency protocols, temporary measures for extraordinary circumstances. But the function will be identical. Collective control of resources according to need, not market price. This is the obscene truth that Iran's water crisis reveals. Capitalism works only in conditions of abundance. When resources are plentiful, markets can allocate them efficiently. Competition can drive innovation. Profit motive can create growth. But when resources hit absolute limits, when scarcity is real and not artificially maintained, the entire logic collapses. You cannot profit from water when there is no water. You cannot compete for resources when competition accelerates, collapse. You cannot rely on innovation when the physics are non-negotiable. At that moment, and this is the moment Iran is approaching, you must choose between ideology and survival. And here is my wager: survival will win, but not before enormous suffering, not before millions are displaced, not before ecosystems collapse, not before the system exhausts every market-based solution that makes the problem worse. Why? Because we cannot imagine the alternative until we are forced to live it. This is the true horror of ideological capture. Not that we believe lies, but that we cannot think outside the structure, even when the structure is killing us. Iran is the test case, the canary in the coal mine, the preview of what happens when environmental limits market fundamentalism. And the answer is already clear: emergency communism. Not as political program, as physical necessity. You can call it whatever you want: climate adaptation, resource management, disaster response. The name does not matter. What matters is the structure: collective control, enforced rationing, planning over profit, survival over growth. This is coming, not because I want it, because physics demands it. And the only question that matters is whether we plan for it rationally or whether we let it arrive chaotically after maximum destruction. Iran suggests we will choose the latter. We will exhaust every market solution. We will build every mega project. We will drill every well. We will construct every pipeline. And when it all fails, when the last reservoir hits zero, when the last aquifer collapses, when the last dam runs dry, then finally we will do what we should have done from the beginning. We will treat water as a commons. We will ration according to need. We will enforce collective discipline. We will subordinate profit to survival. Not because we learned, not because we evolved, not because we became better, but because we had no choice. This is the lesson of the Iran water crisis. This is the future we are creating. And the most disturbing part, we will probably still call it freedom.